Today, our being here is an indication of our government's continual engagement with people.
Rusal is a leading global aluminum producer and one of the world's major producers of alumina. The company was founded in 2000 and following its merger with Rusal and the alumina assets of Glencore, became the global aluminum industry leader in 2007. Bauxite Corporation of Guyana, BCGI, is part of Russian aluminum company Rusal, the largest alumina and aluminum producer in the world. In December 2004, BCGI was launched when Guyana signed a bauxite mining joint venture agreement with Rusal. This week on Dorado Shines, we will take a look at the commissioning of the $4.6 billion bauxite mine at Kurubuka in Region 10. In 2013, the Bauxite Company of Guyana commenced a project to develop a new deposit at Kurubuka 22, located in Arawaima. The project will see the construction of a mine service road and comprehensive production complex to crush, dry, and unload commercial bauxite.
This project has been in the making for several years, and we are also, as a government, I'm quite sure the people of Region 10 will be proud of the fact that the company has demonstrated a high level of confidence, not only in Guyana, but also in this part of Guyana, that it is expending in excess of $4.6 billion in developing this plan. Guyana is open to foreign investment, and we've always ensured that when foreign investors come, that they are given the necessary support, that there is an enabling environment. But very importantly, we insist and ensure that foreign companies too adhere to our national laws, and at the same time ensure that they give back to the community to ensure that the contribution to the country, especially in the development and utilization of our natural resources such as bauxite, that we get maximum benefits to all our people. Many communities, thousands of people in Region 10, perhaps in the early 2000s, notwithstanding the government's injection of resources to keep it alive, perhaps thought that bauxite would be history. And this government, we made it quite clear that we will not see the death of the bauxite industry, and that all steps will be taken to ensure that the industry is not only kept alive, but it is viable. And this investment here by Rusal, as we've seen other investments in other parts of Region 10, is testimony to our commitment, but also it reflects the type of environment our government has been creating to allow such investment.
Government assisting miners. Small and medium-scale operators benefit from duty-free access to all-terrain vehicles or ATVs, excavators, bulldozers, and other machinery used in the mining industry. These waivers on duty are available to new entrants to the sector and for current miners based on production levels. A message from the Guyana Geology and Mines Commission. Rusal owns a 90% stake in the company. The remaining 10% belong to the Guyanese government. In 2006, Rusal acquired the assets of Arawaima Mining Company from the government of Guyana and transferred them to the Bauxite Company of Guyana. Rusal owns licenses to develop the Linden, Kwakwani, and Ituni deposits in Guyana.
A reputable engineering organization estimated construction for this place for 33 months. We built plant for 11 months. During this time, we built the road through this jungle. We built crushing plant. We built conveyors and dryer and ship loading facilities. Everything was done without any interruption in Kwakwani.
This marks another milestone in the whole project of saving bauxite when we came to government. Many of you will recall that the industry was in a really bad state at that time. And there were many predictions from pundits and others that the industry was uneconomical and it should be closed. We insisted that this industry will not be closed, and the government decided that we will keep bauxite. It was a long struggle. Some of the comrades are here, people like Robeson Ben, Vincent Bassington, and others are here who had helped in this fight to save the bauxite industry. Indeed, it was these two gentlemen that first journeyed to Russia to open discussion and to have invited or stimulate the interest of Rusal into Guyana. And today, we can say that the first part of the mission has been accomplished. The bauxite industry is once again on firm footing. We want to see that the wealth that is created in our country is shared by all the people of our country. And in particular, for instance, this investment, we know that communities like Kwakwani, Kururu, and other communities should benefit from this investment in our country. We want to lay the foundation, not only for a better life for us now, but that this life must be sustained. A higher quality of life must be sustained in the centuries ahead of us.
Government assisting miners. In an effort to reduce the cost of fuel for miners, the government of Guyana has granted a fuel import license to the Guyana Gold and Diamond Miners Association Trading Incorporated. Miners also have a concession on fuel where it only attracts 10% CIF excise tax. A message from the Guyana Geology and Mines Commission. The Ministry of Natural Resources and the Environment has launched the National Upstream Oil and Gas Policy. This represents Guyana's first attempt at setting out specific policy objectives and implementation measures for the exploration and potential development of upstream oil and gas resources. Economic advisor to the Commonwealth Secretariat has been part of the team visiting Guyana on a regular basis.
We've undergone a restructuring exercise, really. The idea being to try and make us leaner, meaner, more efficient for our member governments. Now, the circled area there covers the work that myself and my colleague, Mr. Ale Daniel, and the rest of our colleagues in our section do. For those of you who are aware of the work that the CFTC, the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation, have carried out over the years with the member governments, we have focused for about 3 decades now on matters to deal with natural resources. And over time, we've come in different forms. It used to be the Economic and Legal Advisory Services section. Then we moved on to the Special Advisory Services division, spread out our functions a little bit to include matters to do with debt management, for example. But now, our superiors have deemed it wise to call us the Governance and Natural Resources Advisory Services division. Now, within that division, there's a small section of consultants, if you can call us that specialize or focus more on matters to do with ocean governance policy, matters to do with maritime boundaries delimitation and submissions for extended continental shelf. And then there's us, the natural resources guys, who spend our time focusing on matters to do with oil and gas and mineral policy, oil and gas and mineral law, regulation, contracts, negotiations, that sort of thing. The idea being to assist our member countries in making their regulatory, institutional, and governance structures more efficient, more effective in attracting and sustaining investments into this sector. So our names have changed over time, but the remit essentially stays the same. Where we come from? Well, London. We received a request towards the end of 2001 from the ministry to assist with the reform, for want of a better expression, of the legislative, regulatory, and institutional, where necessary, arrangements for the governance of upstream oil and gas operations in Guyana. And there were a couple of diagnostic missions that we embarked upon. My predecessors came in February and then in May. And this is now my third visit to Guyana. I'll be asking for a passport the next time I come. So what we've done with this exercise is to try as much as possible to identify gaps, if there are, in the strategic thinking, in the manner in which such strategic thinking is expressed or articulated in the legislation and the regulatory frameworks, and then to look at the institutional arrangements to see two things. One, the extent to which there is sufficient coverage of all of the aspects of the value chain, and then two, the extent to which there is adequate communication or coordination amongst the various players. So we sat down and said to ourselves, right, and just as Chairman Denison mentioned earlier, it's not a case of there not being any form or any structure on ground. The question we asked ourselves was, at what point are we going to sit down, step away from it and say, right, over the next period of time, short-term, medium-term, long-term, this is our strategic thinking, this is our strategic position in terms of where we want to take our upstream oil and gas sector to. So we thought the best way to do so, or the ideal way to do so, would be to express this in a policy document, which is how we came about this particular draft. So what did we do? We went back to London, put a draft together, came a series of back and forths with particularly the ministry and the GGMC, and there was a period of quiet. Now, the reason I put that very confusing chart in front was to provide a bit of an excuse in terms of the time lag. As you would have observed, there was a request placed towards the end of 2011, but because we've been going through this very challenging transition process, a lot of the work that we were meant to be delivering for our member governments got affected. Just to put things in context, in our team, there are currently 2 advisors operational, looking at live projects at the moment. I mean, we've just recruited a number of other advisors to join us, so we're making progress in that sense. Where are we now? Well, we're here to try and discuss the policy document, and that's essentially why we're here. Thought it would be useful to provide a backdrop of the policy itself and how far we've come. Now, you all have access to the internet. We've seen a lot of reports. The one that struck us in particular was USGS, quite optimistic, assessed portions of the Guyana Suriname Basin province. Now, I've deliberately taken off the figures. Let's not worry about what I've estimated to be the potential resources available to come and look at.
The United States Geological Survey ranks the Guyana-Suriname Basin second in the world for prospecting among the world's unexplored basins, and 12th for oil among all the world's basins, explored and unexplored. In order to have a positive investment climate, a number of mechanisms must be in place.
The next set of slides are really some comments on how we view a positive investment climate between the government and the investment community. And I had not previously seen the prior presentation, but you'll see an incredible number of similarities here as to how we view, from an industry perspective, what needs to be done versus the government. So at the highest level, we want to maximize the country's hydrocarbon resources. There's a finite amount of hydrocarbon out in the ground, and it's our goal, in concert with the government, to optimize the amount that comes out at an economic value. We want to have a structure in terms that are equitable to both. Equitable not meaning 50-50, but equitable in terms of of risk investment, et cetera, with the government. We want to ensure alignment throughout the project life, and that's possibly the toughest thing, as was described already. In the early days, it's all capital investment on the industry's part. We get to a plateau period where everyone's sharing neatly in the value of a plateau production, and then having an agreement that actually addresses what happens past that as you're in decline and reduced incomes and cash flows. How do the agreements work with the government, and how can we still be aligned through those different phases? And the last two comments on here, I think, go for any industry here in Guyana: a stable and sustainable business environment, and really a clear and practical framework for the laws and regulations, which were also addressed. So just touching on these in a little bit more detail, to realize the greatest value, we want to have the maximum economic recovery. What's interesting is, in any oil accumulation, you may or may not be aware, we rarely get 50% of the oil out of the ground, and that's due to the nature of the physics of the rocks and a bunch of other things. But through different types of investment, you can get more and more oil. You can spend a tremendous amount of money and get virtually all of it out, but most of those endeavors are not economic. So we base our decisions on an initial development, and then as time progresses, we get further into that development. You have infrastructure, and then you weigh and measure what other things can be taken on to get more oil out of the ground. One thing that's critical is the duration of the contract terms are consistent with the resource, the life of the resource. You don't want the investor cut off in midstream because he's going to make his investments predicated on the termination of that license, right? So he's going to take a look at where the end is. So the best reservoir management and evaluation of and development of that reservoir is done with a contract that lasts through the life of that resource. Incentives for incremental recovery projects. Those are the things that after you make your initial investments to get the oil out of the ground, what else can be done to get even more oil out of the ground? And those may have different economics and will have different economics, or you would have done them up front, than the initial development. And marginal fields. So we go out into these areas and look for the big field, because that is the one that sets the infrastructure. So once the infrastructure is out there, you have the capability in so many areas to then exploit some of the smaller accumulations that exist. And so how do you stew that into your regulatory framework to make that attractive to the parties? And of course, incentives for applying the best technology. Many companies have their own technologies and want to make sure that technology is protected. Discover and develop and produce resources in the most efficient, safe, and environmentally sound manner. For many in the room, they're going to say, I'm really weak on the environmentally sound part of this. I've really focused on the investment portions here. I think it's critical, and when in developing the framework, that we have incentives for cost efficiency. There's so many agreements around the world where cost efficiency isn't the primary consideration, yet it should be to both parties. As an economic concern, we definitely want to make profit and be cost efficient, but in some of these agreements, you need to take a look at the cost recovery mechanisms and make sure that those provisions are really good for the government as well as the investor. The worst examples are that you can make an economic return drilling dry holes in some of the PSAs just by the way they were constructed, and that makes no sense to anyone. Access to a capable workforce and practical local content. I really want to impress on everybody, the oil companies want as much local content as possible. That's economically smart. We want local Guyanese to be running the operations here and working working through the development and exploitation of the resource. I think in any of the more mature affiliates that we have, we're typically in excess of 95% local content. You always have expertise with some people coming in from other areas. Now the hesitation there is not to put in a line, I think, in the framework that says we need 95% local content, because that's an evolving measure, but it is in the best interest of both the company and the country to get there. So our our comments would be we'd really like to see some flexibility in getting to those ultimate goals, depending on the technical needs and skill sets required to get through the different phases of the development.
The Minister of Natural Resources and the Environment is optimistic of an oil and gas discovery in the country.
In 2011, when the ministry was established and we had a thorough review of how it is do we oversight, manage, and plan for the eventual development of an oil and gas sector, we recognized that we needed to be prepared for the eventuality, and I want to be an optimist, not a blind optimist, not an unreasonable optimist, but the eventuality of a significant commercial oil and gas discovery in our country. And it was our government and, in fact, the people's expectation that those who are entrusted with the responsibility would so take the necessary steps in preparing our country for an oil and gas sector. And when we looked at the framework that existed then, whilst there was significant amount of work and guidelines, and if we look in terms of the legislation, it tended to focus primarily on exploration and in terms of promotion, and did not sufficiently deal with the issue of upstream, meaning when you've hit that discovery, what next? What happens? And we didn't want to be caught, as it were, off guard, and then to commit, and in many regards, the errors we've seen in other places, and I don't want to be singling out any country or any particular situation, but I thought that, and the guidance that was given was that we need to prevent, prepare so as to prevent any untoward or negative consequences as a result of the country being ill-prepared and not ready for an oil and gas sector. And so we entered into a number of engagements with bilateral as well as multilateral partners, and how it is we can get the type of support in having a comprehensive overview of the situation. And the Commonwealth Secretariat services were secured, and hence we're here today. There's many aspects that we have to address, and the consultant and the representative of the Secretariat pointed out. And already we are looking at next steps in terms of implementation. And we will start very quickly in terms of looking at the legislation, because some of the legislation that we have there date back to the 1980s. There are lots of development. We need to, even the model agreement that we have, even that too has to, as it were, has to have some sort of relevance or direct bearing on the legislation. So that for us is a priority. The second issue coming out of the recommendations, and I want to make it absolutely clear that we have no difficulties with the recommendations, the observations, and the proposals that are outlined in the draft policy. So I want to make that absolutely clear. And so it is now moving in terms of how do we address those areas that have been identified, and move very quickly to in having those comprehensively dealt with in the interests of our nation. But the priority will be in terms of legislation, looking in terms of harmonization too, in terms of the different functions, not only for the activities that we have taking place now in terms of exploration, but also how do we in terms of harmonize in looking towards the phase of production and development of an oil and gas sector. And so that will be an area of adequate, we will give adequate attention to, but not singularly with the Commonwealth Secretariat, because as I've said, we've engaged a number of bilateral partners, some near and some far, in terms of looking at how it is we can have the right environment, the right framework, the right system, the right arrangements that will do justice to the people of Guyana in terms of how do we manage the sector in going forward.
Investment in the oil and gas sector may lead to direct business such as engineering, maintenance, fabrication, barging, towing and trucking, all which call for new and improved port facilities, industrial yards, air services, security, surveillance and intelligence. ExxonMobil, the world's largest publicly traded international oil and gas company, which holds an industry-leading inventory of global oil and gas resources and the world's largest refiner and marketer of petroleum products, has begun exploration work in Guyana. Venezuela had objected to this planned offshore exploration for oil. Guyana's Minister of Foreign Affairs dispatched a letter to the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry requesting that the government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela desist from taking any actions that could result in the stymieing of the development of Guyana and its people, and that would be in contravention of international law. The ministry also informed CARICOM, UNASUR, and OAS, the Commonwealth as well as the United Nations Secretary General, about this recent action by Venezuela. Check us out on the internet for this and every episode of Dorado Shines. Just go to YouTube, search for Dorado Shines and start watching, or like us on Facebook and receive instant updates. You've been watching Dorado Shines. Do join us again next week for another program. Until then, do remember that we all have a role to play in protecting the environment.